There comes a moment in a woman's life when something quietly shifts. She doesn't announce it, she doesn't argue anymore. She simply stops accepting what once felt good enough. This is not arrogance. This is not bitterness. This is psychology in motion. This is the moment a woman stops settling for less. The awakening, when tolerance turns into awareness. A woman doesn't stop settling overnight. It happens slowly, almost invisibly. At first, she tolerates small disappointments, missed calls, broken promises, emotional inconsistency. She explains them away. She tells herself everyone has flaws. She tells herself love requires patience. But then something changes. One day, she realizes she has been doing more emotional labor than she receives. She notices she is always adjusting, always understanding, always waiting. This awareness is the first psychological shift. Awareness breaks denial, and once denial breaks, tolerance can no longer survive. Women like Viola Davis have spoken openly about recognizing patterns of self-abandonment before choosing better roles, not just in career, but in life. Awareness is not anger, it is clarity, and clarity is dangerous to anything that survives on low standards. Emotional exhaustion as a catalyst for change. Most women don't leave situations because they're angry. They leave because they're tired, emotionally tired, tired of explaining their needs, tired of justifying disrespect, tired of shrinking to maintain harmony. Psychological studies show that prolonged emotional neglect triggers the same stress responses as overt conflict. The body keeps score. When a woman stops settling, it's often because her nervous system has reached its limit. She may not scream or fight, she simply detaches. This detachment is not coldness, it is self-preservation. Think of Jennifer Aniston, who has spoken about walking away from relationships not out of hatred, but because peace became non-negotiable. Emotional exhaustion forces prioritization, and once peace becomes the priority, settling becomes impossible. The rebuilding of self-worth. From the inside, a woman who settles often ties her worth to how much she is needed, how much she gives, how much she sacrifices. But the woman who stops settling rebuilds her self-worth internally. She no longer waits for validation to feel valuable. She understands that love is not something she must earn through endurance. Psychologically, this is a shift from external validation to internal validation. When self-worth becomes internal, manipulation loses power. Guilt loses power. Fear of abandonment loses power. Michelle Obama once spoke about learning that her value was not dependent on approval, even in marriage and public life. A woman with internal self-worth doesn't demand perfection. She demands respect. Boundary formation. The line that changes everything. The psychology of a woman who stops settling is defined by boundaries, not walls. Boundaries. Walls isolate, boundaries protect. A boundary is a clear statement of what is acceptable and what is not. It does not require anger, it does not require explanation, it requires consistency. At first, boundaries feel uncomfortable. Women are often conditioned to be accommodating, flexible, agreeable. Setting boundaries can feel like being difficult, but psychologically, boundaries reduce anxiety and increase self-trust. A woman who enforces boundaries teaches others how to treat her and teaches herself that her needs matter. Oprah Winfrey has often said that learning to say no was one of the most powerful changes in her life. Boundaries are not ultimatums. They are standards in action, the death of the fantasy and the birth of reality. One of the hardest psychological shifts is letting go of potential. Many women don't settle for what is, they settle for what could be. They stay loyal to a future that exists only in their imagination. The woman who stops settling mourns this fantasy. She accepts reality as it is, not as it could be with enough effort. This is painful, because hope is comforting, but reality is liberating. When a woman stops romanticizing inconsistency, she stops making excuses for patterns. Taylor Swift once reflected on recognizing patterns instead of clinging to chemistry. Psychology calls this cognitive maturity, the ability to hold truth without distortion. Once reality is accepted, settling loses its emotional grip. Detachment from the need to be chosen. A major psychological breakthrough occurs when a woman no longer needs to be chosen to feel worthy. She chooses herself. This doesn't mean she rejects connection. It means she no longer competes for attention, affection, or effort. The need to be chosen often stems from early conditioning: approval-based love, inconsistency, or abandonment. Healing shifts the attachment style from anxious to secure. A secure woman does not chase clarity. She expects it. She does not beg for effort. She requires it. Rihanna once spoke about realizing that love should feel safe, not anxiety-inducing. When the need to be chosen disappears, settling becomes illogical. Emotional regulation replaces emotional reactivity. A woman who stops settling no longer argues to be understood. She observes, she listens, she responds instead of reacts. This emotional regulation is a sign of psychological growth. Reactivity keeps women trapped in cycles of drama. Regulation gives them choice. She no longer feels the urge to prove her worth or defend her feelings endlessly. She knows her truth. And if someone refuses to understand it, she walks away. Calm becomes her power. Silence becomes her answer. This is not emotional suppression. It is emotional mastery. Women like Angela Bassett have described how emotional control, not emotional intensity, became the foundation of their confidence. Regulation makes settling unnecessary because chaos is no longer attractive. Independence as a source of emotional safety. The psychology of a woman who stops settling includes independence, not just financial, but emotional. She knows she can survive disappointment. She knows she can be alone without being lonely. This removes fear-based decision-making. When a woman is not afraid of being alone, she stops accepting half-love. Independence does not mean she doesn't want partnership. It means partnership is no longer a survival strategy. Serena Williams once said that knowing she was whole on her own changed the kind of relationships she accepted. Independence shifts relationships from necessity to choice. And when relationships are a choice, standards rise naturally. Grief as a necessary transition. Stopping settling involves grief. Grief for time lost. Grief for versions of self that endured too much. Grief for love that wasn't mutual. This grief is often quiet and private, but it is essential. Psychology shows that unprocessed grief turns into resentment or numbness. A woman who allows herself to grieve heals faster. She doesn't rush into replacements. She doesn't numb herself with distractions. She sits with the loss and lets it transform her. Grief clears emotional residue, and once grief is processed, clarity emerges. This clarity makes settling emotionally impossible because the cost is now fully understood. Identity shift, becoming the woman with standards. At some point, it's no longer about a specific relationship or situation. It becomes about identity. She no longer asks, "Is this enough?" She asks, "Does this align with who I am?" This identity shift is powerful. Her standards are no longer reactive. They are rooted. She doesn't negotiate her values. She doesn't apologize for her expectations. She understands that standards do not scare the right people away. They filter out the wrong ones. Beyoncé once said that knowing her worth changed every dynamic in her life. Identity-based standards are unshakable, and a woman with unshakable standards does not settle, ever. Discernment replaces hope-based decision-making. A woman who stops settling no longer makes decisions based on hope alone. Earlier in life, hope may have kept her going. Hope that someone would change. Hope that effort would be noticed. Hope that love would eventually become consistent. Hope once felt noble, even romantic. But psychologically, hope without evidence becomes self-betrayal. The woman who has stopped settling develops discernment. Discernment is the ability to read patterns without explaining them away. She listens to actions more than words. She notices consistency instead of promises. This doesn't make her cynical. It makes her grounded. Discernment allows her to stay open without being naive. She doesn't shut down emotionally, but she does not invest blindly. Women like Maya Angelou famously spoke about believing people the first time they show you who they are, not as bitterness, but as wisdom. Discernment saves energy. And when a woman values her energy, she refuses to spend it on situations that drain her spirit. Self-respect becomes non-negotiable, even when it costs connection. The psychological evolution of a woman who stops settling is this. She chooses self-respect over attachment, even when it hurts. This is the hardest line to cross, because walking away from something familiar can feel more painful than enduring what is inadequate. But once self-respect becomes non-negotiable, staying in misaligned situations feels worse than leaving them. She understands that loneliness is temporary, but self-betrayal leaves a lasting wound. Psychologically, this is emotional adulthood, the ability to tolerate short-term discomfort for long-term integrity. Women like Lupita Nyong'o have spoken about how self-respect reshaped not just their relationships, but their entire sense of peace. At this stage, she no longer asks herself, "Will I be loved if I leave?" She asks, "Can I love myself if I stay?" And with that question answered, settling is no longer an option. Peace becomes the ultimate measure. The final psychological marker of a woman who stops settling is her relationship with peace. She measures decisions by how they affect her inner calm. If something costs her peace, it costs too much. She no longer confuses intensity with intimacy or chaos with passion. Peace becomes addictive. And once a woman experiences peace, she will never trade it for uncertainty again. Peace is not boredom. It is safety. It is alignment. It is self-respect in its highest form. When peace becomes the priority, settling becomes incompatible with her life. A woman who stops settling doesn't become cold. She becomes clear. She doesn't ask for less emotion. She asks for more consistency. She doesn't fear being alone. She fears abandoning herself again. This is the psychology of a woman who knows her worth. And once she knows it, there is no going back.